Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination. I'm Dr. Russell Dawn, Associate Professor of History and Political Thought, and we have quite an evening in store for us here at Concordia University in Irvine. It is part of our university's mission to empower students through the liberal arts, the arts befitting a free people. To pursue the liberal arts is to pursue truth and goodness and beauty. It is to ask timeless questions, such as, what should I believe about God, about humankind, and how should we be governed? And what's the nature of a just society? The liberal arts comprise the great conversation among people of goodwill across generations and cultures about matters of universal consequence. They're the arts that help us to understand what it is to be human. This evening's event exemplifies the liberal arts, as matters of freedom, equality, and justice are at the heart of this debate. Here we will witness and participate in a practice that seems to be dying in America: civil discourse. And the demise of civil discourse, of reasoned disagreement, is a very bad sign for a free people. For the experience of history tells us that freedom cannot long survive without civil discourse. It is the food of freedom. And this evening, in our little corner of this free society, we will receive nourishment. But this is no mere exercise. How should our society, if it is to be a just society, handle the conflict that arises when claims of religious liberty give rise to claims of discrimination, or vice versa? Our honored guests, Dr. Ryan T. Anderson and Dr. John Corvino, have reached largely, but not wholly, opposed conclusions about this matter. Their book, Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination, co-written with them by Sharif Girgis, is a wonderful example of well-reasoned, spirited civil disagreement. In a few moments, they will renew their debate here. I said before that we will not only witness the debate, but participate with them in it. We will do so by a question and answer session in which students will have the first priority at the mic. I urge you to give due honor to our speakers and to the nature of this event by keeping your questions respectful. There should be no attacks upon a speaker, but only questions aimed at probing more deeply into the issues. After the Q&A, our speakers will be at a book table just outside those doors in case you have a copy of the book that you would like them to sign. Please note that this event is being broadcast by live stream and by Facebook Live, as well as recorded to be made available at a future date. We ask that you not record the event on your own device. Also, please silence your devices. It's interesting that this event began as a student reading group, sort of a book club among 10 students and me. These students deserve to be recognized for their serious and entirely voluntary engagement with the author's text. Will the reading group please rise and be acknowledged? Now, please join me in thanking those who have made this event what it is. The Department of History and Political Thought is sponsoring the debate, and we have received tremendous support, support without which we could not have achieved this. That support has come from President Kurt Krieger and from Provost Peter Sankbeil, and from the University Convocation Series, as well as Cui Bono, and from the Departments of Marketing, Innovative Instruction, IT Services, University Services, campus safety, and graduate admissions. Finally, the reading group and the debate were made possible in part by a grant from the Charles Koch Foundation. Our hearty thanks to all of them. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this debate, Professor Conrad Hack. Professor Hack is an assistant professor of communication studies here at Concordia. Until this past August, Conrad directed the university's speech and debate team, which won the National Parliamentary Debate Association's national tournament in 2013 and 2015, while finishing second in 2014, 16, and 17. Professor Hack.
Speaking first will be Dr. John Corvino, and he is a professor of philosophy and the incoming dean of the Irvine Reed Honors College at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. He is the author or co-author of several books from Oxford University Press, including Debating Same-Sex Marriage, What's Wrong with Homosexuality, and most recently, Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination, that he co-authored, of course, with Sheriff Gurgis and Ryan Anderson, who is, of course, his co-panelist for the evening. In addition to his scholarly articles, Corvino has contributed to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Detroit Free Press, the Huntington Post, the New Republic, Slate, and various other popular venues. In the last 25 years, he has spoken at over 250 campuses on issues of sexuality, ethics, and marriage, and his online videos have received over 2 million views. Slacker. 2 million views, that's impressive. Ryan Anderson is the William E. Simons Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He is the author of When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Movement and Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, and the co-author of What is Marriage, Man and Woman, a Defense and Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination. Anderson received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and his doctoral degree from the University of Notre Dame. He has made appearances on ABC, NBC, CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox News. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, the Harvard Health Policy Review, and the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy. His research has been cited by 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices in 2 different Supreme Court cases. Would you welcome both Mr. Anderson and Mr. Corvino? The format of the debate is pretty simple. The first speech will be 15 minutes offered by Dr. Corvino. Mr. Anderson will respond for 20 minutes, and then a final statement of 5 minutes. So, let's begin.
Well, thank you very much. It is a great honor to be here at Concordia University, and it is particularly an honor to be here with my friend Ryan Anderson. And people are sometimes surprised when they hear me refer to Ryan as my friend. They say, how can you, as an LGBT rights advocate and as a gay man yourself, be friends with someone who has so actively fought against marriage equality? And the answer to that question is actually rather simple. I drink. I wondered how that joke would go over at a Lutheran school. It's actually, the answer to that question is complicated, but at least part of the answer is that Ryan and I believe that serious public issues deserve a thoughtful public dialogue, and that dialogue happens better in relationship, when we can actually come together at a table and get to know each other and build a relationship of trust. At the same time, I think it's important for you to know that it's not always easy. You watch us up here on stage and you notice that we have a good rapport with each other, and that's real. You'll notice that we respect each other intellectually, that's real. If you go out later on, you might see us having dinner together and drinks, lots of drinks. And that's real. But there were times in the 2 years we worked on the book where we got angry with each other. We got frustrated with each other. And it's important for you to know that that's real too, because I believe in that first thing I said. We want there to be more thoughtful public dialogue. And if we want that, I think we have to be candid with people about the fact that it doesn't come on the cheap, that it requires being vulnerable, that it means that sometimes you're going to get under each other's skin, and yet, if it matters to you, you keep going. So I'm particularly grateful to Ryan and to Sharif for sticking with this process over the last few years as we produced this book and have had this ongoing conversation. And I do think of it as a conversation. This has been billed tonight as a debate. It's supposed to warm you up for the State of the Union address or something like that, I don't know. But really, I see it as a kind of dialogue, and that's especially true because of the topic. I mean, debating religious liberty and discrimination, you'll be unsurprised to learn that there's not a pro-discrimination side in the book and an anti-discrimination, not an anti-religious liberty side in the book and a pro-religious liberty. We're all in favor of religious liberty. We're all against unjust discrimination. But we have a lot of disagreements about various overlapping issues in the neighborhood. And in order to focus my remarks tonight, I'm going to concentrate on the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which is currently before the U.S. Supreme Court, because that case encapsulates a lot of the issues that motivate the book and this larger debate. So, facts of the case. In 2012, Charlie Craig and David Mullins, a gay couple, enter Masterpiece Cake Shop in Lakewood, Colorado, start flipping through a catalog with pictures of cakes. The owner of the bakery, Jack Phillips, comes over to them and says, "May I help you?" They said, "Yes, we're here to order a cake for our wedding." And Jack Phillips said, "I'm sorry, I don't do cakes for same-sex weddings. That conflicts with my beliefs about marriage. I'll sell you other things. I'll sell you birthday cakes and cookies and so on, but I cannot sell you a cake for your wedding." The couple left the cake shop, later filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. The commission found Jack Phillips liable for sexual orientation discrimination, which is prohibited by Colorado's public accommodations law. And various Colorado courts have agreed with the commission's decision, and now the Supreme Court is reviewing the case. Now, when you think about this case, you might have a very common reaction, which is, really, cakes? Do you have to make literally a federal case out of this? I mean, it's cake, right? And you might say, if it were you, you just go to another bakery. And I might have done the same thing. But it's not the court's job to think about what you would have done or what I would have done. The court's task here is twofold, to ask two questions. First, did Jack Phillips actually break the law? And second, is that law consistent with our broader constitutional principles, particularly principles of freedom of religion and freedom of speech? And to foreshadow my answers to those two questions, and that's going to focus my comments today, are going to be yes and yes. Yes, Jack Phillips did break the law, the anti-discrimination law. And yes, that law is consistent with principles of free speech and freedom of religion. So let's start by looking at the law in question. The relevant portion says, "It is a discriminatory practice and unlawful for a person, directly or indirectly, to refuse, withhold from, or deny to an individual or a group, because of disability, race, creed, color, sex, sexual orientation, marital status, national origin, or ancestry, the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations of a place of public accommodation." And nobody doubts that, as far as Colorado law is concerned, this counts as a place of public accommodation. Now, it seems clear to me that Jack Phillips did not give the gay couple the full and equal enjoyment of his bakery services. But you might say, well, no, wait, no, his bakery just has limited services. He doesn't do gay wedding cakes. You might try to analogize it, say, to a kosher bakery that won't do a cake made with lard, or a vegan bakery that won't do a cake made with real buttercream. You might just say, gay wedding cakes are not a thing that Jack Phillips sells. To which I have two responses. First, a gay wedding cake is not a thing. Wedding cakes have no sexual orientation. Gay people order their cakes from the same catalogs as everybody else. How many of you have ever had opportunity to order a wedding cake? Just a few of you. Okay, Valentine's Day is coming up, you know. Okay. And you pick the size, the shape, the number of tiers, what kind of icing, what kind of filling, what kind of cake, and so on. And we pick our cakes from the very same catalogs. Now, if Jack Phillips had said, hey, I won't do a cake with two grooms on top, or I won't make a wedding cake with rainbow icing or something like that, that would have been different. Because then he would have what I call a design-based objection instead of a use-based objection. And here I think it's useful to compare this case to another case that happened just a few years later at Azucar Bakery in Denver, Colorado. 2015, a customer, his name was William Jack, walks into Azucar Bakery and says to the baker, Marjorie Phillips, here's what I want. I want you to make me a Bible-shaped cake, and on one side I want an image of two men with a red X through it. And on the other side I want Leviticus 18:22, homosexuality is a detestable sin. Leviticus 18:22 is, man shall not lie with man as with woman is an abomination unto God. That's a lot to put on a cake. He paraphrased. Homosexuality is a detestable sin. And Marjorie Silva said, I'm sorry, I don't believe in that, I won't do that design. And William Jack, who was there to make a point, obviously went to the commission and said, hey, this is discrimination based on religion. And the commission said, no, it's not. And you might say, well, what's the difference? The difference is that Marjorie Silva said, here's what I'll do. She said, I will sell you a Bible-shaped cake because that's something that I would sell to any other customer. I will even give you an icing bag so you can write on it whatever you want. I just won't write that particular message or do that particular design. Hers is a design-based objection. Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Cake Shop, by contrast, said he would not sell any cake to the same-sex couple. He didn't even discuss designs with them. And in fact, his bakery once declined a cupcake order to lesbians who were celebrating their commitment ceremony. This is discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So part of my answer to this is, okay, there's this design-based versus use-based distinction. But now I also want to say something about how use-based, in some cases, becomes user-based, and thus violates the anti-discrimination ordinance. Because sometimes there are particular activities that are so closely identified with certain traits that discrimination against the one is tantamount to discrimination against the other. So Jack Phillips says, look, I'm happy to serve gay people. I'll sell them birthday cakes and things. It's just I won't do cakes for a same-sex wedding. And to me, that's like saying, look, I'm happy to serve Jews. I just won't sell them a cake if they're going to use it to celebrate a bar mitzvah. Well, wait a second. Having a bar mitzvah is one of those activities that's constitutive of being Jewish. The trait and the activity are intimately connected. To discriminate against the one is to discriminate against the other. Use-based becomes user-based. There are going to be times when it is difficult to decide whether an activity is a direct expression of a protected trait or whether it's more loosely or indirectly related. Sometimes that's a hard thing to decide. This is not one of those times. Sexual orientation is about the relationships we have or desire to have. It's a relational property. To discriminate against people in same-sex relationships on the basis of those relationships is sexual orientation discrimination, which is why I think it's clear that Jack Phillips violated the anti-discrimination ordinance. Which brings me to my second point, second question I want to consider. Okay, you might say, well, he violated the ordinance, but maybe this ordinance goes too far because maybe it tramples on his freedom of speech and freedom of religion in violation of our Constitution. And in fact, this case is being argued primarily as a free speech case. Now, I think that that's a mistake, treating cakes in this kind of context as speech. And I think the easiest and quickest way to see that is by comparison to another example of discrimination, racial discrimination. Now, I want to make something clear. I'm not using the race analogy because I think sexual orientation discrimination is exactly like racial discrimination. In some ways, they're similar. In other ways, they're very, very different. I'm using that analogy because it's a case where I think we're likely to have more similar intuitions. And sometimes when you have a hard case, like the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, or a case that looks hard, it's controversial, it's helpful to go to a case where we have the similar intuitions and then compare them and see what's different or similar about the cases. So let me talk about an actual person I talk about in the book, Keith Bardwell. Keith Bardwell is was a Louisiana Justice of the Peace. And in 2009, it became clear, it was reported in the news, that Bardwell would not perform weddings for interracial couples. Now, Bardwell said, and sincerely believed, that he had no problem with black people. In fact, he told a reporter that he had, quote, piles and piles of black friends. Piles. But he said, look, I just don't believe in interracial marriage. And so what he would do is he'd quietly refer the people to a colleague, but he was pressured to resign. Now suppose that Bardwell opens a bakery. And he says, look, I don't discriminate against black people. I will sell people of all races, all different kinds of things, birthday cakes, cookies, and so on. But I don't want to make a cake for an interracial wedding because that forces me to say something I don't want to say, namely that I endorse this wedding. It's a violation of my freedom of speech. I think if Bardwell said that, we'd say, no, this is not about free speech. It's about discrimination in services. And many of the things that people say in the Jack Phillips case, you could say in this Bardwell case. He's a creative professional. He's using his artistic talents. It's a matter of his personal conscience. All of that is true, and yet I think we'd say he should not be given a free speech exemption from the anti-discrimination law. What's the difference? Now, I think I know what you're going to tell me. The difference is that Bardwell's just wrong about discrimination on race. And I agree with you, Bardwell is wrong about race. But remember, free speech is not just about speech we agree with. Free speech becomes most important when people are saying things that are deeply unpopular. And yes, we can all agree that Bardwell is wrong, but if this is a free speech matter, then presumably he should be allowed to say what he wants to say just as much as Jack Phillips. I don't think it is a free speech matter. I think it's a matter of discrimination in service, and that the cases stand or fall together. Now, I want to conclude on an important point. A lot of people look at these cases, the bakery cases, the florist cases, and so on, and they think, really, cakes and flowers? I mean, is this the worst problem facing gay people, that you can't buy cakes and flowers? And it's like, no, actually, it's not the worst problem facing gay people. And so I think it's very important to remind ourselves that anti-discrimination law is not mainly about cakes and flowers. Broadly speaking, it's about discrimination in housing and employment and basic goods and services. It's about people like Jack Zawadski, an 82-year-old man in Mississippi, who last year was dealing with the terrible thing of a dying partner, his partner of 52 years, an 86-year-old man, Robert Husky. And their nephew called a funeral home and said, hey, we've got somebody dying. He's probably going to die in the next few weeks. Can you do a cremation and a memorial service? The funeral home said, absolutely, of course. A week or two later, nephew calls again. It's going to happen any day now. My uncle's dying. Can you do the funeral service? Absolutely. Cremation, funeral service, that's what we do. And then Mr. Husky died. They went to the funeral home. Jack Zawadski started filling out the paperwork and made it clear their relationship. It was his husband. They had just recently gotten married after being together, like I said, over 50 years. And the funeral director said, oh no, we're not doing that funeral. No, we don't serve your kind here. And then someone who was grieving, someone who had just lost his partner of decades, had to cancel a memorial service and find a funeral home 90 miles away. So when people say to you, Why do you have to make such a fuss over cakes and flowers? It's because it's not about cakes and flowers mainly. It's about equal treatment when we enter the public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to John for those excellent opening remarks. And I want to echo what he said at the very beginning about the importance of trying to engage in constructive dialogues and disagreements like this, and the challenges. And I want to thank John for all the graciousness that he showed towards me and towards Sharif throughout the past 2 years as we've been working on this. What I want to do in the time that I have for my kind of opening remarks / rebuttal is highlight two large areas. First, how to think about discrimination, and then how to think about liberty protections, whether it's free speech protections or free exercise of religion protections. And so first I want to say, when we're thinking about discrimination, we have to go through a series of questions. We have to say, what is discrimination? Second, when is discrimination unjust discrimination? Not all discrimination's unjust discrimination. Third, when should unjust discrimination be made unlawful? When do you want the government stepping in and regulating these actions? And then fourthly, how should the government make it unlawful so that it doesn't accidentally penalize good actions and interactions as if they're unjust? So let me give you some concrete examples of how we in the United States have done this. At one point in the United States, we enslaved people based on the color of their skin. After the abolition of slavery, we then segregated people based on the color of their skin. Even after legally mandated segregation was made unlawful, many stores, companies, hotels, businesses, schools continued to discriminate against people based upon the color of their skin. And so we passed laws saying that you can't discriminate on the basis of race. We made those laws very broadly applicable, so they applied in many, many contexts, and we made exemptions to them virtually non-existent, because it's very hard to think of any good interactions or good decisions that are being made on the basis of race. You can't think of when is race relevantly taken into consideration if you're a business or a hotel or a hospital or something like that. So we no longer have drinking fountains that say colored and white. We no longer have bathrooms that say colored and white. We no longer have restaurants that say we don't serve your kind here. Thankfully, right, the law appropriately stepped in, saw an injustice, and combated it. Contrast that with how we've combated discrimination on the basis of sex. The problem here, we've never enslaved people based upon their sex, but we did exclude half of the human race from various opportunities. At a certain point, women weren't receiving four-year college educations. At a certain point, boys would take economics in high school and girls would take home economics. And so we had all sorts of forms of sexism, and the government combats this. The federal laws on discrimination on the basis of sex are much more narrow than they are on discrimination on the basis of race. There is no federal ban on discrimination on the basis of sex in public accommodations, for example. So it's entirely legal under federal law for Dunkin' Donuts to say we don't serve women. And as far as we know, no Dunkin' Donuts do that. But there's no law against it. So they could, at least at the federal level. Many states and cities have local laws against this. But what we did when we banned discrimination on the basis of sex, and the main federal law is Title IX, right? And the reason that I mentioned home economics and higher education was that for a long time, women weren't receiving equal educational opportunities. And so Title IX passed in the 1970s, 1972, says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in higher education. But it says you can take sex into consideration when you're doing dormitories, and when you're doing sports teams, and when you're doing locker rooms, and when you're doing bathrooms. And so leave aside the debate about gender identity. Leave aside the debate about transgender identities. Because everyone agrees, regardless of how you define who's a man and who's a woman, it's appropriate to have separate sports teams for men and women. It's appropriate to have separate locker rooms for men and women. It can be appropriate to have separate dormitories for men and women. That's not an unjust form of discrimination. And so Title IX was nuanced. Title IX made clear what is unjust and wrong when you're taking the sex of a student into consideration to therefore treat them badly. Women, you can't take these classes. And when is it okay to take sex into consideration? Women, you don't have to share a bathroom with men. Right? And so they said, how can we actually promote a good, just outcome here by taking sex into consideration when it matters, not taking it into consideration when it doesn't matter? A third set of examples. Our laws have said that pro-life medicine is neither discrimination on the basis of sex in the good sense nor the bad sense, because it doesn't take the sex of the pregnant person into consideration at all. So it's neither unjust discrimination on the basis of sex, nor is it justified discrimination on the basis of sex, because pro-life doctors aren't saying because you're a woman, I won't perform an abortion on you. They're saying because I believe the unborn child has a right to life, I won't perform an abortion. And so we've never used, despite some activists' attempt to use, we've never used our discrimination laws that say no discrimination on the basis of sex to force pro-life doctors to perform abortions, to force Catholic hospitals to offer abortions, to force Lutheran medical school students to learn how to perform abortions. We have robust conscience laws, both for moral conscience and for religious beliefs, against forcing someone to learn how to perform an abortion, assist in an abortion, or pay for an abortion. Even though we had cases that have reached the Supreme Court where activists said pro-life medicine is discrimination on the basis of sex. This is what the court said in response to that claim. They said, let me find the quote here. It's in a 1993 case called Bray v. Alexandria Women's Health Clinic. The Supreme Court said, whatever one thinks of abortion, it cannot be denied that there are common and respectable reasons for opposing it, other than hatred of or condescension towards, or indeed any view at all concerning women. So it said pro-life medicine doesn't flow from animosity towards women. In fact, it doesn't flow from any consideration of the identity of the pregnant person at all. No, I think something similar is going on in the Jack Phillips case. Jack Phillips' opposition to same-sex marriage isn't based on hatred of or condescension towards gay people. In fact, it's not based on any view concerning the potential two grooms or two brides at all. So in that Bray decision, the case from 1993, the court said, whatever you think about abortion, it cannot be denied that there are common and respectable reasons for opposing it. In the Obergefell decision, so just 2 years ago when the Supreme Court redefined marriage, Justice Kennedy, as he writes the majority opinion redefining marriage in all 50 states, he says that the belief that marriage unites husband and wife is held, quote, in good faith by reasonable and sincere people here and throughout the world. Kennedy continues to say, many who deem same-sex marriage to be wrong reach that conclusion based on decent and honorable religious or philosophical premises, and neither they nor their beliefs are disparaged here. So in the case before the Supreme Court now with Jack Phillips' case, the question is, can the state of Colorado disparage Jack Phillips and his beliefs by saying that when he acts on his belief that marriage unites husband and wife, he's engaged in an unjust, unlawful form of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? Because if you recall from John's opening remarks, he said the Colorado law says you can't deny anyone the full range of services because of their sexual orientation. So let's think through, what would it look like to have either sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination? Because these statutes frequently go together. They're known as SOGI statutes, sexual orientation and gender identity. So imagine there was a hospital that says, because you're gay, we won't do your chemotherapy. They're taking your status as gay, your sexual orientation, into consideration, where it's utterly irrelevant to then treat you less than equally. Right? This is much more like taking someone's skin color into consideration at the water fountain. You're taking it into consideration where it doesn't matter to then treat them less than equally. Or imagine someone who says, as John mentioned, we don't serve your kind here. Right? That's opposition to someone based on their identity. What John reports about that funeral home, they said, because you're gay, we don't serve your kind here. But that's not what Jack Phillips said. Jack Phillips said, I'll sell you any other item in the store. The Colorado judge who adjudicated the case has a quote where he says that Phillips says, I'll sell you brownies or cupcakes or cookies or anything else for your same-sex wedding. The thing I can't do is a custom-made wedding cake. Because in Phillips' understanding, all of those cakes communicate a message. They communicate support for this union as a marriage. So for the same exact reasons that other baker that John mentioned couldn't do the anti-gay cake, right? They couldn't bake a cake that communicates a message that they disagreed with. And whether it has writing on the cake or not is ultimately besides the point. Because I think John's distinction between design-based objections and user-based objections misses what is the more fundamental consideration for both bakers, which is a message-based objection. The reason the baker wouldn't bake a cake that said homosexuality is a detestable sin is that the baker doesn't believe that. And the baker doesn't want to have to bake a cake that communicates a message that she disagrees with. The reason the baker wouldn't bake a cake with a Bible and then two men with an X across it is because she doesn't want to send that message. In the same way, Jack Phillips can't do a custom wedding cake when he knows it's going to be used to celebrate a union of two men at a wedding ceremony when he doesn't believe that's marital. And so this has nothing to do with the identity of the people requesting the cake. Phillips didn't say, we don't serve your kind here. Phillips says, I'll sell you anything else. I can't do this not because of who you are, but because of who I am. Now, the reason Jack Phillips named his cake shop Masterpiece Cake Shop is for two reasons. The first is that he wants to remind himself that in every cake he bakes, he's serving Jesus. He takes Jesus' admonition in the Gospels that you can't serve two masters seriously. And so he wants to think that in everything he does 9 to 5, Monday through Friday at his job, he's being a disciple just as much as when he's in chapel on Sunday morning. That the cost of discipleship is a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day thing. And so that's one reason why he called it Masterpiece Cake Shop. The other is that he calls himself a cake artist. And the reason that people go to his cake shop to get their wedding cakes done is because he makes these masterpieces of edible art. There was his logo is a painter's palette with a French whisk, showing that combination of art and baking. A Colorado paper about 5 years ago, before this case had come to light, did a profile of him, and they described his bake shop as, quote, a gallery of cakes. So some people go to the art gallery to see sculpture, some people go to art galleries to see paintings. Jack Phillips has an art gallery of frosting and dough and batter. And his tools, he paints on the cakes, he uses pipettes. That's his technique. And he says, I can't help celebrate something and communicate something that I disagree with. Now, surprisingly, many of the Supreme Court justices seem to be agreeing with Phillips and his attorneys on this point, including Anthony Kennedy, the Supreme Court justice who authored the 2 Supreme Court opinions redefining marriage. But remember, when Kennedy redefined marriage, he also went out of his way not to disparage people who disagree with him. Because not every disagreement is discrimination. Not every disagreement needs to be treated as some unlawful form of behavior. So during oral arguments, first Alito pointed out that at the time when Phillips was asked to bake the same-sex wedding cake, the law in Colorado was that marriage unites a man and a woman, and Colorado wouldn't recognize an out-of-state same-sex marriage. And so Alito says, wait a minute, so this same-sex couple, they can't go to the state of Colorado and receive a marriage license or have their out-of-town marriage license recognized. And then he continues, quote, and yet when he goes to this bake shop and says, I want a wedding cake, and the baker says, no, I can't do it, in part because same-sex marriage is not allowed in Colorado at the time, he's created a grave wrong? How does that all fit together? So Alito's pointing out, how can it be discrimination for the baker to be acting on the same exact definition of marriage that the state had enshrined in its constitution? It's also worth pointing out that within a 2-year time frame, the citizens of Colorado voted to define marriage as the union of husband and wife and voted to ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. They wanted to do both of those things simultaneously, to say that unjust discrimination against gays and lesbians is wrong and it shouldn't be lawful, but support for marriage as the union of husband and wife is not an instance of unlawful and unjust discrimination. They wanted it to be nuanced in the same way that the laws that ban discrimination on the basis of sex were nuanced. To say, look, sexism is wrong, but pro-life medicine isn't sexism. Sexism is wrong, but separate soccer teams for men and women aren't sexism. And so the question here is, can we find something similar? A way to say that a person who says we don't serve your kind here to a same-sex couple is discriminating on the basis of their identity. But a person who says, I believe that God has created us male and female, and that male and female are created for each other in marriage, and therefore I can't do anything to celebrate something that goes contrary to that, is not discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. It's worth pointing out that Phillips has a long history of turning down other requests. He won't do any cakes for Halloween because he's the type of Christian that thinks we shouldn't celebrate Halloween. He won't do any cakes with alcohol because he's the type of Christian that thinks we shouldn't consume alcohol. He won't do any cakes that are anti-American because he's the type of American that is very patriotic. He also won't do any cakes that celebrate divorce because he's the type of Christian that thinks we shouldn't undermine marriage. He was once asked to do a traditional 3-tiered white wedding cake that he would then cut in half to symbolize the divorce and to celebrate the divorce. And he said, no, I can't do that. That's an event that I can't celebrate. It's a message I can't send. Now, in none of these cases has he been accused of discrimination on the basis of maybe it's religious identity, because some people celebrate Halloween out of a religious devotion. It's All Hallows Eve originally. He wasn't accused of discrimination on the basis of marital status in the case of the divorce cake. People who are divorced celebrate their divorces. In none of the cases has he been filed a complaint, has a complaint been lodged against him except for this case. And I think that highlights something that's going on with SOGI laws. Historically, anti-discrimination laws were used as shields to protect people from unjust discrimination. Now we're seeing anti-discrimination laws are being used as swords to punish people who have politically incorrect views about human sexuality. So in the past decade, we've seen public opinion widely shift on LGBT issues. Jack Phillips now finds himself in a dwindling minority of people who believe marriage unites husband and wife. And so these laws are not being used to shield a beleaguered minority from unjust discrimination. They're being used as swords to, quote, punish the wicked. And the reason I say, quote, punish the wicked, is that the largest backer of these sexual orientation and gender identity anti-discrimination laws, Tim Gill, a man who lives in Colorado, was interviewed in the Rolling Stone magazine this winter, and he said that he had pledged $500 million to passing SOGI laws, and he said, we're going to go into the deepest southern states and we're going to punish the wicked. That's what's going on here. We're weaponizing the redefinition of marriage to punish people who we now say are on the wrong side of history. So just as it was wrong when historically we had rampant anti-gay bigotry and we would punish gays and lesbians, it's now wrong to punish the people in the new cultural minority. And that's not to deny that homophobia and anti-gay bigotry still exists. It does, and it should be condemned, and we should combat it. But it is to say that not every viewpoint about human sexuality is anti-gay bigotry, or for that matter, anti-trans. So let me give you another example. Right now, there are 2 Catholic hospitals that are being sued, one here in California and one in New Jersey, because they don't do sex reassignment surgeries. And the argument is that because they won't remove the uterus from a woman who wants to become a man, that they're discriminating on the basis of gender identity. And their response is no. The identity of the person asking us to remove her uterus plays no role in our reasoning process. We don't think it's good medicine to remove a healthy, functioning uterus from anyone, whether they identify as a woman or they identify as a man. We're not in the business of removing healthy organs, regardless of the identity of the person who asks us to do this. What's underlying this is a disagreement about what good medicine looks like for gender dysphoria. Some doctors say that the appropriate medical response to gender dysphoria is sex reassignment procedures. And sometimes that could be a social reassignment, sometimes that could be hormonal, sometimes that could be surgical. It's different in each case. And that's one viewpoint on this. And it's a viewpoint that we should take seriously and consider and think about. But there's another viewpoint here, and that's the viewpoint that people with gender dysphoria, you shouldn't respond to their bodies, but you should try counseling to their minds and to their emotions, and that the appropriate response is talk therapy and psychotherapy and things like that. And that's another reasonable viewpoint which we should consider and wrestle with. Neither of those viewpoints is discriminatory. And it's a problem in our culture if we use the laws to say that one of those sides, if you want to practice medicine that won't reassign someone's body, but you want to help their mind realign with their body, that you're engaged in unlawful discrimination. It would have been the same thing had we said back in that 1993 case that when a pro-life doctor won't perform an abortion, he or she is discriminating on the basis of sex. And so imagine what the consequences would have been. It would have meant the elimination of Catholic and Lutheran and Latter-day Saint and some Orthodox Jewish and other faith-based hospitals. They couldn't exist any longer if they would have to be complicit in what they saw as the unjust taking of human life. And so something similar is now at stake. Because as John said, it's not just about cakes. So we're seeing right now that faith-based schools, whether they're Orthodox Jewish, Roman Catholic, Evangelical, Lutheran, Latter-day Saint, Muslim, Orthodox schools of those religious traditions that believe we're created male and female and that male and female are created for each other, they're at risk of losing their nonprofit tax status. During oral arguments in Obergefell, Justice Alito asked the Solicitor General of the United States, what's going to happen to these faith-based schools? Will they be treated the same way that Bob Jones University was treated? Bob Jones was a fundamentalist school that had a policy against interracial dating, and they lost their nonprofit tax status. And so Alito wanted to know, will we now be saying people who think this way about marriage are the functional equivalent of racists? And so what would happen if this school lost its nonprofit tax status and had to start paying property taxes to the state of California and income taxes to the federal government, and its donors could no longer deduct their donations to this school from their own income taxes? You would see the costs of operating the school go up, and you would see the revenue dry up. What would happen if this school lost its accreditation? So you were no longer receiving an accredited 4-year degree from Concordia. What would happen if this school lost its eligibility for subsidized student loans? So if you wanted to study here, you had to pay full sticker price. You weren't eligible for financial assistance. It's more than just about cakes. The question here is, will we be saying that people who believe what Christians have always believed about marriage and sexuality are now violating laws? Are they unjust and therefore unlawfully discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation? The same thing is true for charities. We've already seen that faith-based adoption agencies have been forced to shut down in several different states, including Boston, in Illinois, in San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., because they wanted to find orphans' homes with married moms and dads. And this, again, provides a good illustration. The argument of a Catholic charity adoption agency is that children deserve both a mother and a father because men and women aren't interchangeable, that moms and dads bring different gifts to the parenting enterprise, that the two best dads in the world can't replace a missing mom, and the two best moms in the world can't replace a missing dad. Now, you can agree or disagree with Catholic Charities about that, but whatever it is, it's not discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. It never takes sexual orientation into consideration. And you can't say that mothers and fathers are different and both are important is somehow anti-gay. They're just two separate considerations. And so we need to make space for these two viewpoints to coexist. So that's where I want to close at the, I have a minute left, so I'll just close with this. At the end of oral arguments, in the end of the exchange, Kennedy points out with the attorney for the state of Colorado, he goes back and forth and he says, well, look, what if the baker just says, I have nothing against gay people, I'll sell them anything in my store, but I believe marriage unites a man and a woman. Is that discrimination on the basis of orientation? And the attorney for the state of Colorado said, yes, it is. And then Kennedy responded, your identity thing is too facile. So Kennedy, the justice who wrote the opinions redefining marriage, was apparently, and again, it's hard to read the tea leaves during oral arguments, apparently was rejecting the argument that this was a case of discrimination because he was claiming that the argument Colorado was making was too facile with respect to identity. And then he closed with this statement. He says, tolerance is essential in a free society. It seems to me that the state in its position here has neither been tolerant nor respectful of Mr. Phillips' religious beliefs. I think Kennedy got this right. It'll be interesting to see what he does in a couple months from now when they decide the case. But what he should do is he should say that 2 years ago, he voted to give gays and lesbians freedom to live their life in accordance with their beliefs, and that this year he's going to vote to give Jack Phillips freedom to live his life in accordance with his beliefs. Thank you.
You know, sometimes it may seem like I have an unfair advantage in having the last word coming up for the final 5 minutes before we go to Q&A. But first of all, they get the last word in the book, which was much more valuable. Second of all, there are two of them, so it's kind of like 2 against 1. And third, Ryan always changes what he says and the order in which he says it and what is it. So I have 15 seconds from the time he finishes speaking to the time I come up to organize my own thoughts and try to do justice to the wide range of things he covered. And he did cover a wide range of things, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to them. So I'm just going to touch upon a few points here and hope that more of this comes out in the Q&A. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about some of the other issues beyond Masterpiece Cake Shop, although I think it's important to acknowledge that some of these issues are very complicated. Ryan talked about segregated locker rooms and sports teams and so on, and how, when we talk about sex discrimination, it's not discrimination to have separate sports teams for boys and girls, and virtually everyone agrees on that. We also know, though, that very often that this is one of these cases where separate but equal turns out not to be equal, and the men's sports teams get a lot more funding and a lot more support than the women's sports teams. It's a very different kind of case, though, than a case where a baker says, no cake for you at all. Which brings me to the comparison with the Marjorie Silva Bible-shaped cake case, where Ryan said, look, in both cases, the case of Marjorie Silva and the case of Jack Phillips, what you have underlying there is a message-based objection. But this is not entirely right, because remember, Marjorie Silva says, I will sell you the same cake that I would sell to any other customer. I'll even give you an icing bag so you can write whatever message you want. Not true of Jack Phillips, who would not sell them any cake, did not even discuss designs because he would not sell them any cake for their wedding. And all the stuff about his unwillingness to do Halloween cakes or cakes with alcohol in them and so on, those are all design-based, not use or user-based objections. Ryan says that when Jack Phillips refused to sell them the cake, it had nothing to do with their identity. And I have to say that I bristled a little bit when I heard that, because the idea that our fundamental relationships, our significant others, the people around whom we organize our lives, have nothing to do with our identity. Again, to me, it's kind of like saying to a person, look, I will sell Jewish people all kinds of things in my store. They can buy brownies and cupcakes, but I will not sell them anything for their bar mitzvah, and that has nothing to do with their identity as Jews. Well, of course it does. Just like same-sex weddings and same-sex relationships have everything to do with my identity as a gay person and with the identity of the couple in the Masterpiece case. Finally, I want to go back to my point about Bardwell Bakery and remind you that so much of what gets said here could be said in that case. It's a hypothetical case, right? But remember, Bardwell says, I will sell you anything else in the store, but I'm a cake artist. Imagine him like fashioning himself, you can call it Bardwell's Masterpiece Cake Shop. I don't want to contribute my artistic talents. It's not that I don't want to have anything to do with people of different races. Remember, Bardwell has piles and piles of black friends, and I believe him that he does interact with people, but interracial marriage is a bridge too far for him. And suppose he said, look, I just don't want to sell you a cake for your wedding. How do you say that that is discrimination on the basis of race, but in this other case of Masterpiece Cake Shop, it's not discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? I don't think we can make that distinction. I don't think it works. Let me conclude by saying something about context here. Because I think Ryan is right, that if the baker said, I would sell you nothing, or if a hospital said, look, I won't treat you because you're gay, just like a funeral director who says, I won't do a funeral for you because you're gay, that's much worse. I believe that that's much worse. It's why I brought this up, because that's the kind of thing that I think is fundamental about the necessity of anti-discrimination laws. And by the way, Mississippi does not have an anti-discrimination law covering discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So it looks like that funeral refusal may be perfectly legal in the state of Mississippi. But I don't want you to think that in the cake cases it just doesn't really matter. Because remember the context here. Gay people have been told, often from a very tender age, that our longings for intimacy, for relationship, are sick, unnatural, immoral, an abomination unto God. And we hear that sometimes from our parents, from our pastors, from the people that we would normally count on for protection and support. Against that kind of backdrop, it should not surprise you that when a gay couple walks into a bakery and is told that they cannot buy the very same items that their neighbors can buy, that those pretty cakes that they see in the catalog, yeah, those are nice, but they're not for you. Against that backdrop, it should not surprise you that they feel discrimination. It's not just about their hurt feelings. It's humiliating. It's exclusionary. And it's wrong. And I think Charlie Craig and David Mullins, the customers in this case, deserve better. And I look forward to having a better conversation around these issues and the broader issues of religious liberty. Thank you very much.